What is Christian conservatism and liberalism? Well, most people assume that Christian conservatism and Christian liberalism are opposing theological camps. They're not. They're rival responses to the same unresolved problem. And that problem didn't begin with modern politics or denominational disputes. It long predates them both. To understand it, we don't begin with Christianity. We begin with human knowing itself. So, across cultures, across centuries, across religions and philosophies, truth is almost always divided the same way. On one side, truth is treated as something concrete, enforceable, measurable, anchored in power, law, body, continuity, or survival. On the other side, truth is treated as something meaningful, aspirational, ethical, inward, or ideal. One side insists truth must be grounded in what is, the other insists it must answer to what ought to be. Now, these two postures argue constantly. They correct one another. They borrow from one another, but they never resolve. They can't. Because they aren't disagreements about truth, they are replacements for it. The real question isn't which side is right. The real question is why human knowing fractures this way at all. To see that, we have to go back further than politics, further than philosophy, and even further than theology, as it's usually discussed. Now, this is a massive subject, and one short video is not going to do it justice, and will, of course, raise more questions than are answered. But we can sketch out the problem and the result and relate it back to the Edenic state and sin in a way that makes Genesis 1-3 a real revelation about the world that was to come, instead of just a story about how a generalized sin entered the world. So let's go back to the fall and just reconsider some things. The fall is an epistemic fracture. What if Adam and Eve were never meant to function primarily as biological representatives of male and female, but as a unified human consciousness standing in perfect agreement under revelation? Not an agreement through negotiation, not an agreement through balance, agreement through reception. Before the fall, knowledge isn't discovered, inferred, or constructed. It's given. Truth doesn't arise from the world or from within the self. It proceeds from God outward. Adam and Eve don't represent competing perspectives. They share a single revelatory orientation. Truth precedes them. Their agreement isn't compromise, it's obedience. The fall, then, isn't merely a moral lapse. It's the collapse of that mode of knowing. Humanity doesn't fall into ignorance. It falls into self-reference. Now, once revelation is no longer trusted, truth has to be replaced. And there are only two ways to do that. Either you cling to what can be controlled, or you generate meaning where control fails. What was once a unified act of knowing fractures into rival strategies for compensating for what was lost. So this is the birth of the divided human mind. Now, life after the fall. This is knowing as survival. After the fall, human knowing no longer begins with truth. It begins with survival. Humanity finds itself in negative parity with a hostile world. Knowledge becomes adaptive. What works is trusted. What preserves life is retained. Memory, technique, continuity, and power become substitutes for revelation because they allow existence to continue in a broken environment. Now, at this stage, There's no illusion of mastery. Necessity forces limits. Knowledge remains grounded because failure carries consequences. This is the earliest form of conservatism, not an ideology, a posture. Conservatism begins as realism under constraint. It preserves what stabilizes life because instability threatens survival. Now, from survival to mastery. As history advances, this posture compounds. Human mastery over nature increases. Agriculture, architecture, law, engineering, empire, and administration create stability at scale. The world becomes ordered. By the time civilization reaches its Roman apex, this conservative posture reaches full expression. Nature is subdued. Society is structured. Philosophy systematizes what power has already secured. At this point, conservatism still remembers necessity. Authority exists because it once had to. Order is justified by memory of chaos. But something subtle begins to change here. When meaning detaches from necessity. Once survival is secured, meaning no longer needs to answer to constraint. Concepts begin to float free of necessity. Ethics, metaphysics, religious beliefs, and interior experience start to function independently of material grounding. Truth no longer has to correspond to what is in order to feel compelling. It can be generated by aspiration, imagination, or moral vision. This is the quiet birth of epistemic liberalism. Not political liberalism, but a shift in how truth is located. Meaning begins to arise from within the human domain rather than being received from beyond it. Rome is the hinge. Before Rome, conservatism is grounded by necessity. After Rome, conservatism persists without remembering why. And idealized meaning begins its long ascent. Now, after Rome, conservatism no longer preserves necessity. It preserves forms. Tradition remains, but its original grounding is forgotten. Authority is inherited without remembering why it once mattered. Stability becomes self-justifying. Continuity replaces truth. At the same time, meaning continues to detach. Theology becomes abstract. Religion becomes conceptual. Revelation becomes symbolic rather than evental. Truth is no longer something that happens to humanity. It becomes something humanity manages. This fracture defines the entire post-Roman world, including the church. At this point, the two default postures of fallen human knowing fully emerge. One anchors truth in structure, law, power, body, and continuity. The other anchors it in coherence, ethics, intention, and inner conviction. These are what philosophy later names realism and idealism. But they aren't schools of thought. They are reflexes of a mind cut off from revelation. Each claims sufficiency. Each excludes the other. And both are attempts to recreate artificially what was once given freely. Now look, why the Reformation does not escape this divide. This is where resistance will be the strongest. So it has to be said carefully. Those who identify with Christian conservatism or Christian liberalism often trace their lineage to Luther or Calvin, assuming one side preserves the Reformation while the other departs from it. That assumption is mistaken. Luther and Calvin do not stand prior to this fracture. They stand firmly within it. They are not preserving an older grounded conservatism. They are reformers responding to a late conservative collapse using tools already shaped by emerging liberal assumptions about authority, access, and meaning. This does not make the Reformation false or insincere, it makes it situated. Rome had preserved authority after losing grounding. Form remained, hierarchy remained, sacrament remained, but prophetic necessity had been abstracted away. Luther reacts against this decay, but the instruments he uses already relocate authority into the human domain. Consider what Luther actually addresses. What we are circling is not incidental overlap, but structural continuity. The Reformation does not merely anticipate modern liberalism rhetorically. It reorganizes the epistemic architecture in ways that secular liberalism later inherits and universalizes. First, the universal priesthood of believers does more than redistribute access to God. It dissolves mediation as a necessary epistemic category. Once sacramental authority no longer constitutes access to truth, authority becomes functional rather than ontological. This aligns directly with modern liberalism's insistence that no class, office, or institution possesses intrinsic interpretive priority. In secular form, this becomes the axiom that no voice has privileged access to meaning by virtue of position. Expertise may exist, but it cannot be final. The modern citizen stands to the state, morality, and truth in much the same posture that the Reformation believer stands to God, unmediated, self-authorizing, and individually accountable. Second, the rejection of proprietary religious knowledge does not stop at opening Scripture. It establishes transparency as a moral good. Meaning must be public, accessible, and contestable. This is the same logic that later governs liberal commitments to free speech, open inquiry, and the suspicion of esoteric or guarded knowledge. Once revelation is no longer something guarded and delivered by a custodial authority, but something distributed and interpreted horizontally, knowledge itself becomes desacralized. In secular liberalism, this produces the conviction that truth emerges from circulation, debate, and exposure, rather than from reception of an already given word. Now, third, the elevation of conscience marks a decisive internalization of authority. Obedience is no longer grounded in submission to an external revealed command, but in fidelity to inward certainty. Luther's appeal to conscience before emperor and council is not merely theological courage. It's an epistemic declaration. Truth is authenticated inwardly. Modern liberalism inherits this directly in the primacy of sincerity, authenticity, and personal conviction. Moral legitimacy is measured not by conformity to an objective order, but by coherence with one's internal commitments. Even when liberal societies appear to share values, the final arbiter remains the individual conscience. Now let's consider a fourth. The collapse of the theological distance between clergy and laity introduces egalitarianism, not simply as a social ethic, but as an epistemic assumption. If no qualitative distinction exists between those who know and those who are taught, then authority becomes provisional and revocable. This logic matures in secular liberalism as hostility toward hierarchy itself. Hierarchy is no longer suspect because it might corrupt revelation. It is suspect because it claims any enduring asymmetry of authority. What begins as equality before God becomes equality of interpretive standing, and finally equality of truth-making power. Now, additional examples sharpen the alignment. The sola scriptura principle, the ostensibility, while ostensibly anchoring authority, actually relocates authority into interpretation. Competing interpretations cannot be resolved by appeal to a living authoritative voice, only by further argument. This anticipates liberal proceduralism, where disagreement is managed rather than resolved, and legitimacy comes from process rather than truth. Now, likewise, the Reformation's polemic against tradition as binding authority establishes a default posture of critique toward inherited norms. Tradition must justify itself to the present conscience. Secular liberalism universalizes this into suspicion of all inherited structures, whether moral, cultural, or metaphysical. Nothing is authoritative simply because it has been received. Taken together, these moves don't escape the conservative-liberal divide. They generate it. The Reformation shifts the center of gravity from revelation as a completed, externally given act to the believing subject as an interpreter and guarantor. Liberal secularism simply removes the remaining theological vocabulary and leaves the structure intact. What was once the believing conscience before God becomes the autonomous self before reality. The logic is the same, only the object has changed. Calvin differs in emphasis, but not in trajectory. His systematization of doctrine stabilizes meaning conceptually. Authority is relocated from sacrament to text, coherence, and doctrinal mastery. In both cases, Scripture is elevated. But the controlling question quietly changes, not what makes Scripture true, but by how it functions. Fulfilled messianic revelation is no longer the uniform external center that judges interpretation. Meaning must now be accessed, organized, and defended within human cognitive frameworks. This is the liberal envelope. Not liberalism as permissiveness, but liberalism as the relocation of authority into conscience, reason, system, and access. This is why modern Christian conservatism is mistaken when it imagines itself as simply holding the line. It conserves Scripture and morality, but within an epistemic framework already shaped by post-Roman idealism. Likewise, modern Christian liberalism is not a betrayal so much as an acceleration. Once authority is internalized, expansion is inevitable. Both descend from the same fracture. One stabilizes the inheritance, the other radicalizes the access. Now here's a shared error. Immanent transcendence. Here's the decisive point. By New Testament standards, both conservatism and liberalism are worldly. Not because they are immoral, but because they are immanent. Both assume transcendence can be approached, managed, or lived with through human means. One through preservation and mastery, the other through imagination and aspiration. Both are strategies for living with transcendence without obeying it. We have to remember, when we're talking about conservatism, we're talking about it as the same era of liberalism, and I have not gone into the same detail as I have with Protestantism and liberalism. And by doing this, I don't mean to say for 1 second that the Catholics are right or the Orthodox are right. They share in the same sin. Because what conservatism claimed to do is go back to some original revelation and conserve and keep it and maintain it and revere it. But they do not go back far enough. The furthest they will go back is the 4th century. And this is their sin. It's the cowardice of Adam in Eden, who would not restrain his wife. Now, here's the assumption between them both. He does not extend human capacities inward. He interprets them from the outside. He does not help humanity coexist with transcendence. He reveals it in a form that judges every attempt to control it. This is Christ. Conservatism can't reign over Christ because Christ invalidates preservation as a source of truth. Liberalism can't reign over Christ because Christ invalidates imagination as a source of meaning. Christ is not balanced between them. He is not refined by them. He is not completed by them. What Christ offers is not a new posture, but a new paradigm. He is the fulfillment of what God said would happen. A truth neither survival nor imagination could produce, of revelation that enters history from outside it and establishes knowledge by fulfillment, not by authority, coherence, or conscience. The transcendent real and the transcendent ideal do not arise from the world. They invade it. And when they do, conservatism and liberalism cease to be options. They're now exposed as rival evasions of the same demand, recognition. Here's a final disclosure. And like I said, I'm just sketching the outlines. We're just thinking. I'm not necessarily being dogmatic about these things, but I'm close to being dogmatic. For centuries, we've taken Genesis, the story of Eden in the fall, as something very prosaic. Something that essentially is not a revelation about the world to come. It's just a story about how sin entered the world. Genesis 3:15 is not messianic. It's just about how the enmity between man and snakes started. What I'm doing is I'm starting with a premise. What I'm thinking is this. See if you agree with me or not. Should we expect something more from Genesis than our interpreters are telling us insofar as revelation? I think we should. A transcendent revelation gives to the world something it could not otherwise have. And what the interpreters tell us about Genesis is something that anyone could come up with on their own. Think about this for a second. Christ is not the crown of human development, conservative or liberal. He's the judgment and reordering of it. Until Christ is known as the one Moses and the prophets said would come, conservatism and liberalism will continue to argue loudly, preserve fiercely, imagine endlessly, and miss the same thing.